Welcome to another in our series of Kehillat Israel podcasts. This is a recording of Rabbi Amy Bernstein's weekly Friday morning Torah study.
We are going to be studying this morning Parashat Behar. If you'll remember, we're in a leap year, which means we split all the double parshiot, all the times that they normally come together. We split them this year. So normally Behar and Bechukotai are read together, but they're not for us today. So we're going to look at chapter 25 of the book of Leviticus. We are speaking of the Yovel. We're speaking of Shemitah. We're speaking about the relationship of the Israelites. And then if you're going to read Israelite right relationship to anything dealing with godliness or holiness, then ultimately it's humanity's relationship to that should be, in general, unless we're talking about specifically Israelite things like shellfish or pork, right? Those seem to be just about Israel being distinct as a people. But there are some things I think that there's a more fundamental rightness that Torah seems to understand being the case. And this is one of those, I think, that the relationship to the land, the relationship to production, there seems to be an understanding in ancient Israel that there's a right way to be in relationship to the land. There's a right way to be in relationship to the idea of the economic class system, and that this is about equity and justice at its deepest levels. So it's easy for us to go, oh, really, Shemitah, really, Jubilee, right? So, it's not the sexiest, most exciting material. And I think really, if we can go to that place of being what Kaplan said, people who are rooted fully and firmly in two civilizations, the American civilization and the Jewish evolving religious civilization, this is one of the places they deeply inform one another. And in that sense is a very important parsha. See if you can spot the line of Torah that is a very, very famous icon of American civil religion. 25. Someone want to begin?
The Lord spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai. Speak to the Israelite people and say to them, when you enter the land that I assign you, the land shall observe a Sabbath of the Lord. 6 years you may sow your field, and 6 years you may prune your vineyard and gather in the yield. But in the 7th year, the land shall have a Sabbath of complete rest, a Sabbath of the Lord. You shall not sow your field or prune your vineyard. You shall not reap the aftergrowth of your harvest or gather the grapes of your untrimmed vines. It shall be a year of complete rest for the land. But you may eat whatever the land during its Sabbath will produce. You, your male and female slaves, the hired and bound laborers who live with you, and your cattle and the beasts in your land may eat all its yield.
Okay. So God speaks to Moshe on Mount Sinai and says, speak to the Israelite people and say to them. The rabbis, it's not lost on the rabbis that, wait a minute, we're going back to Sinai. Right? We haven't been in Sinai. I mean, we've been in the book of Leviticus, which is the instructions to the priests. And then all of a sudden, as we're closing out this, this dissertation on here's how holiness is to be maintained by the priesthood. And again, we're not sure if that's written for the priest or the people. That's a whole nother discussion. But right at the end of that, we get this whole business about, and God spoke to Moshe at Sinai. So whatever's coming has a bigger sense to it, right? We're back in that flash, we're back in that moment at Sinai, and God says to Moshe at Sinai, and we get Shemitah? It's not lost on the rabbis that it's this, all of this amazing stuff about holiness and sacrifice and living in right relationship and Kedusha and blah, 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 and then all of a sudden, Shemitah is what the flashback to Sinai is about. So there's a big, corpus of rabbinic literature on why or what it means that it's Shemitah. And if you consider Shemitah to be less important, then it's like, it's to show that every single commandment came from Sinai. Every single one. And each of us has a relationship to one commandment. For some, it's Shemitah. For other people, it's, kashrut. For other people, it's something else. Every single mitzvah derives from God speaking at Sinai, and it's up to us to determine which exact mitzvah it is that speaks to us at any given time. Okay. If you consider Shemitah to be important, then it's like, well, of course, this is the core of what it means to be, right, a human being living and a human society living in right relationship with godliness. What would that be? If you say Shemitah is desperately important, that's why it flashes back to Sinai here. What's the core concept? Why is that so? What's so important? This is all about human society living in right relationship to God and the land. What's the big idea here?
You have limits.
You have limits. Tell me more about that, Laura.
Well, there's people and there's the land, and nobody's there to restrain them but themselves. They can do whatever they want, except they can't.
They can do whatever they want, except they shouldn't.
Because of this, they cannot. Right.
So I want to push you on can't. They're not allowed. Which means why? If they're not allowed, and it's God saying you're not allowed, right? Then it's they shouldn't. Right. They can. Yeah. But right, so this is the core of what it means to live a life of godliness. Is there are things you can do that you shouldn't. So you Israelites are now going to be given this land. We're going to look closely at the biblical language because we're going to understand what given means based on this language. You're going to be given the land, and you could work it all the time. It's without limitation now that you have the land, what you get to do with it, except to live in right relationship with the source of life, Yud Hey Vav Hey, you shouldn't. You should do what?
Take care.
Take care. And how do we take care of the land?
By resting it.
Letting the land rest. You human beings could work 7 days a week, 25 hours a day. You could, but you shouldn't. And it is no different for the land. This is a personification of the planet, which is a beautiful, beautiful thing, if you ask me. Right? If we really took that seriously today, can you imagine the sermon? On what if we really personified, in the best way, personified the land? What would we do differently?
Well, the sense here is that the land doesn't belong to us.
So this is where we're going to look.
God.
We're going to look very carefully, exactly at the language, because it tells us something. All right. So
it's interesting. The English, the word he uses, the word that's used is assign. Not that I give you, I assign to you. That it means that I'm giving you, you're sort of a caretaker here. You're going to look after it for me. That's what I take the word assign.
Very nice close reading, Ruben. Very nice close reading. So that you're responsible for it. You are taking care of it. Like Bert says and Ruben says, for me, capital M. For me. So the Hebrew here is ani notein lachem. What does notein mean? Give.
Yeah.
It's very straightforward. It's very simple. It's give. Why did the people writing the English of this, choose the word assign? Because they've done their homework and they've read all the stuff below the line. And all the stuff below the line talks about what we know from Akkadian. Once we found a bunch of documents in Ugarit, we found a bunch of legal documents, and once we found those, we knew from the Akkadian that there are direct cognates. Akkadian, you'll recall, is a parent language of Hebrew. So from the Akkadian, we know what some of this Hebrew means once we found those documents, and based on that, you can't say notein means give. It can't mean that. It has to mean something more like assign. All right, so, and we'll see why. So you may sow for 6 years, and you may prune your vineyard. You got to prune a vineyard twice a year. You prune it in the spring, and then you prune it again once the buds have happened in the summer, in June or July. You trim it again. You prune it again so that, right, it produces the way it's supposed to. Vineyard here could mean wine, and some people think it might also mean olive orchard, right? 2 very important crops in the ancient Near East and in Israel in particular. And you may gather in your yield, right? But in the 7th year, it will be Shabbat Shabbaton. Where's the other place we see this language of Shabbat Shabbaton? Yes! Laura gets the gold star. Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur. So tell me about some resonances that happen with Yom Kippur, even back in this time.
There's a lot of...
What's the flavor of Yom Kippur? Forgiveness for what? For wrongdoing. So there... To what?
To God.
To God.
Wrongdoing to God.
Wrongdoing to God through behavior, right, that we do with each other, or in this case, right, I think the resonance and implication is to the land, right? So when you start using the language of Shabbat Shabbaton, even ancient Israelites knew ruh-roh, right? This is serious about how we behave. And this is serious vis-a-vis whether or not God's presence can dwell among us. And if God's presence in ancient Israel doesn't dwell among us, what happens?
We're screwed.
Thank you, Mickey. We're screwed is the technical biblical terminology.
Rabbi Amy, are you suggesting that there's a hierarchy of mitzvot? Like before you were saying, well, maybe this is the one that I feel really connected to. Like we get to choose? Because that's...
God forbid. God forbid. I should say that. Chas v'chalila. Chalila. So, right, rabbinically, that's like sacrilege, right? Right. So it's a good point that you bring up. I think the resonance is about there's wrongdoing that y'all do to each other, and that involves me, like Bert says, that God says that involves me too. And if you don't behave correctly vis-a-vis the land, that also has a significant amount to do with me, right? There's the Shabbat Shabbaton that the land, here's what it is. The Shabbat Shabbaton that the land gets is as important in its reality as Shabbat Shabbaton is for y'all in yours.
It all balances.
You need to take that as seriously as you take your Shabbat Shabbaton, which is Yom Kippur. Yeah? That's just as important. Okay.
What happens to the land that was set aside every year for like the quarter or the borders for the poor during this period of fallowness?
So what's interesting, Margot, that you bring up is in this period of fallowness, everybody's equal. The poor and the people who own the field are eating the same way. They're all just collecting what's there. Nobody can harvest, right? Everybody's coming. Presumably they would still come and harvest what's there at the edges, just like the regular Israelites who own the field, they get no more than that either. I mean, proportionately, they probably get more. But it's this whole thing is an equalizer, right? This and Yovel, as we're going to see, and then it goes on later in Bechukotai, the parsha that comes after this, it goes on to talk about people. This is the great equalizing of the society, which Rabbi Jacob Staub has a lot to say about.
What does the word Shabbaton mean?
It's a very good question. What does Shabbat? Usually it is used along with Shabbat. So it is Shabbat, Shabbaton. So in Hebrew, when you double something like that, you change the form, but you double the root, it's an emphatic. And it's very hard to put in English. So often, like this translation says, a Shabbat of complete rest. Is it a great translation? No. Is it as close as we can get in English? Probably. But It's something more like way Shabbat. Super duper Shabbat, right? Like, so that's how I tend to translate those doubles, is like way. Supersize me. Blanche?
There's a story in Rube's family that in a town in Poland, there was a baker who would take in the women's casserole of what they were going to eat on the Shabbos, keep it in the oven. And what he would do is even out the amount of food in each casserole. And I thought it was such an example of what we're talking about.
Unbelievable, Blanche. What an amazing story. So he would take all the casseroles into his oven to keep them warm, because, of course, the women couldn't cook on Shabbos. And then so from all the people who brought it in, he would just kind of scoop from one, if it was fuller, into one that was emptier. That is amazing. Now, something about that's got to be midrash, because if you've spent a lot of time making a casserole, tuna casserole, and somebody else makes whatever, you can't tell me that somebody's not going to notice that there's a big glop of chili in your tuna casserole. But I love what a wonderful story about, what a wonderful idea about, because I think that story, as it got passed around and told in that Polish village, is about what should be. In other words, whether it happened or not is not important. Everyone knows that what the baker was doing was one of the highest mitzvot possible. Right? That's how it should be. That somebody should be manipulating and making it all even, and we get them back and go, oh, good, my casserole.
It wasn't a casserole, it was a chillin', and everybody made it the same way.
Okay, there you go. That now it's believable. Ruben has given me the commentary that makes it fully believable. It was cholent, and everybody made it the same way. Now you could have it be evened out, and I would totally. All right. So, and because the other thing about that story is it implies that the people who brought a big casserole didn't miss the amount that was gone, or they wouldn't have brought it back week after week, would they? I mean, there's an implication that if we all just gave a little bit that we wouldn't really miss, then the people whose bowls are not so full would have plenty. That's a profound message and reminder.
It's a wonderful story.
It's a wonderful story. Thank you, Blanche. All right, so we're back at the very exciting work of pruning. So you prune twice, once in the spring, once in the summer. You shall not reap the aftergrowth of your harvest, right? So what grows after the harvest, this is what Margot goes to. You're not allowed usually to go back because it feeds the poor, but you're going to leave it because, you're not going to harvest the grapes of your untrimmed vines. They are untrimmed because they are off limits. They haven't been pruned, right? Because they are off limits. You're not going to grow them for the Shemitah year. But you may eat whatever the land during its Sabbath will produce. So whenever you're dealing with an agrarian culture, an agrarian society, during the planting season, during the growing season, the winds blow seeds everywhere. And so often what grows the next year is stuff that got blown to where it is. So there's often, you don't have to plant often for there to be growth the next year. It's just not going to be nearly, of course, what you're used to. Mickey?
There's often the growth anyway from the following year.
Correct. So second and third growth. There are Hebrew terms for second growth and third growth, which is fascinating, right? That they were so connected to the land that they have a word. Like Eskimos, have 73 words for snow, right? The Israelites had a special term for second growth and third growth. Who knew?
The sense was, though, that it was God that was making those things happen.
Well, no, there was their understanding that those things just happened, but we're going to see where God is implicated in that. So you may eat whatever the land during its Sabbath will produce. You, your male and female slaves, right? Back to Margot's point, this is the great equalizer, the hired and bound laborers who live with you. So why do laborers live with you?
They're like indentured servants.
They're indentured servants.
Close to the field.
So they're close to the field. You've got so many folks who are indentured that they come from further away than they can just kind of go back home. Sometimes these are foreign laborers. Sometimes these are Hebrews. These are Israelites. Talk to me about indentured servitude. How does that happen? What happens that somebody's indentured?
They couldn't go back alone.
So you couldn't. So you have a crop. You buy seed. You plant your crop. The crop fails. Now what? I need to. How do I get seed to plant for the next harvest? What do I have to do?
Borrow it from somebody. Or buy it.
And what do I put up as collateral?
My work. Myself.
My land. I put my land up as collateral. Now the crop fails. Now I can't pay back the loan for the seed and the labor to plant and sow and all of that. And so now I've lost the land. Now I have no way to feed my family. I have no way to buy seed. And it's not my land to plant on. So now what do? I either indenture myself or I indenture my children. My children leave my land and go live on somebody else's estate, and they work off my debt as I work the land. Yes? So it is not uncommon. It was not uncommon that you had indentured servitude in Israel of Israelites, controlling the labor of other Israelites. That is why and how we get so many laws in Torah about how you should treat your Hebrew slaves. People go, what? Hebrew slave? Wait, it's Hebrew indentured servants for the most part.
And slaves.
Slaves are the ones you get by conquering somebody else.
So they're both.
Yes.
Slaves are treated with the same rule?
Yes. Well, there are some rules that are different for Hebrew slaves. But for the most part, they are the same.
It just seems like it was their form of social welfare. I mean, they didn't have unemployment or Medicare, so you have to think of a way to take care of the people that, of course it works to the benefit of the person who wins, but it's a little bit like that was their system.
Correct.
It wasn't their decision, though. Here, the decision to do this comes from God. It says this is what you should do.
No, I think she's talking about indentured servitude. Was their system for
So ugly, but
kind of feeding.
working through the economics of how it
Well, and frankly, this is the way it still works today.
yeah.
You go to agrarian third world, societies that are marginally sustaining themselves. Something happens. There's a famine. There's a drought. There's a failure of the crops. What do you think happens? They sell their children to pay off their debts into servitude, and lots of people are buying them. As Rabbi Rubin likes to say, there are more slaves in the world today than ever before. Ever before in history.
But there's no limitations on their slavery.
Correct. That's exactly right. It is unregulated. Exactly right. All right. So everyone may eat. Then 8.
You shall count out 7 weeks of years, 7 times 7 years, so that the period of 7 weeks of years gives you a total of 49 years. Then you shall sound the horn loud in the 7th month on the 10th day of the month, the Day of Atonement. You shall have the horn sounded throughout your land, and you shall hallow the 50th year. You shall proclaim release throughout the land for all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you. Each of you shall return to your holding, and each of you shall return to your family. That 50th year shall be a jubilee for you. You shall not sow, neither shall you reap the aftergrowth or harvest the untrimmed vines, for it is a jubilee. It shall be holy to you. You may only eat the growth direct from the field.
Okay. Anybody see the verse? Did you find it? Show me, Sarah. What is it?
12.
Where?
You shall proclaim liberty throughout the land. Where is this found in our American civil religion? The Liberty Bell. This is the quote on the Liberty Bell, right from here.
You said that last time.
Right? It's a bit ironic now that we're going to study it. It's a bit ironic that it's on the Liberty Bell. Let's see why. So, you shall count off 7 weeks of years. An interesting mix of terminology. A Shabbat of years. Kind of, right? So this is truly about some kind of moral implication around rest, around, we're going to see, around release. 7 times 7 years, so that the period of 7 weeks of years, right, again, an interesting terminology, gives you a total of 49 years. Then what are you going to do?
Sound the horn.
You're going to blow a tru'ah on the shofar. Tru'ah is the big, right? The big one. You're going to blow a big one in the 7th month, on the 10th day of the month, which is what? Yom Kippur. So lest we should think we're reading too much into Shabbaton business and the resonance of Yom Kippur, ta-dam, here it is. Yovel, Jubilee, is declared for that 50th year on Yom Kippur. And you shall hallow the 50th year, yes? V'kidashtem et shnat ha'chamishim. What have I taught you kadosh means? Set apart. It is set aside. This year becomes something that is set aside for purposes having to do with right relationship with God. That's what Kuf Daled Shin always means. Rabbi Nick.
So we're in the midst of another really interesting 7 and 7 cycle right now as we speak.
Indeed, and what would that be?
That would be the whole cycle of the Omer and the counting of the Omer that ascends to Shavuot. Another one of these set aside, the 50th day being the day upon which we receive Torah. So just to put in another resonance here, that this 7 and 7 cycle, that kind of ascent to something, always ascends to something, of great magnitude within New Year.
Of great magnitude. Thank you.
There's a brandy in Israel, Sheva, Sheva, Sheva.
There are too many 7s there.
What that ascent is about is an interesting question. So Margot asks, are there other ones, right? So it's interesting that 40 is generally the number we get about a cycle, right? About completion. So the fact that it's 7 times 7, the one after that, seems to be like, bum, 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 bah, the big one, right? The big cycle. Shavuot, from Pesach, from liberation to becoming a people in relationship to God, that's a big one. And from how it is now to how it ultimately should be, boom, that's a big one. Because we're going to see what Yovel does. Yovel is radical, people. It is radical.
Seems to me, though, that there would have been a lot of indentured servants and slaves who would not have lived to this day.
Correct.
And who would have died in indenturehood and in slavery.
Correct. Torah is taking the long view. This is not, it's a very good point, Paula. It is not about the individual, right? Which is important for us to remember. Torah, in this case, is concerned with Israelite society. And we tend to focus so much on the individual, right? That, oh yeah, but my father didn't live to see Yovel, right? And that is our American reading of this, which is wonderful and fine, and I'm glad we have concern for the individual, don't get me wrong. Torah's concerned, this seems to be a societal thing, right? That there should be a way that things are reset so that at least your father's family gets a release, right? Because they thought in terms of clan. The unit was the clan. And so there's a sense of you're resetting the relationship of the clans to each other. Trying to get back to equity, which we're going to see. And Rabbi Jacob Staub talks a lot about, how amazing and radical that is and how limited in some ways. So and it's limited in some ways by already the categories of clan, who belongs to one, who doesn't. You had to be an Israelite then, descended from Israelites, because that's who got the land, and that's how it reverts. And so there's all these complicating factors that don't make it completely equitable. It's still a radical idea, right?
And there's also the category of who is deserving and who is not deserving.
Okay, now wait. Deserving, you're starting to use different language than Torah.
But it's part of our culture today.
Ours today, 100%. Who deserves to have enough food and nutritious food and a good education and decent health care and vaccinations and a future.
And who
deserves to be helped.
And who is undeserving.
100%. And this idea right here completely undercuts that and says it is immoral. It is ordained by God that everybody should, at some point, go back to not being poor. Okay, so you shall, okay, let's go down here. We're at Yom Kippur. You shall have the horns sounded throughout your land, and you shall hallow the 50th year. What is the next verse? Dror ba'aretz, you shall proclaim. Ukratem dror ba'aretz l'chol yoshvea yovel hi. So we get this interesting terminology, dror, which is a Hebrew name, if you can believe it. Dror, it's like you have marbles in your mouth. But it is a Hebrew name in Israel because it has this amazing history. Dror does not mean liberty. So the Liberty Bell actually is wrong. Shh, don't tell anybody. But, right, it's not a good translation of what this means. Because what's on the Liberty Bell, yay, that makes total sense as the American revolutionaries call to, right, we will be free, we'll be liberated from what?
Oppression of the king.
The oppression of the king, the tyranny of the British, right? Monarchy and the system whereby we pay taxes, but we don't, get to have any say in what happens. That's fantastic. What does dror mean? Now that we have the Akkadian documents from Ugarit, what we know is that word is a technical term about real estate. And it is about the sale of real estate. And it is about what happens when you release your hold on real estate.
You mean debt? Debt's released?
No, it's you have to use different terminology to talk about the kind of ownership you have of land. There's an ownership where you have to say the words in Akkadian in the legal document forever and ever and ever and ever. Not to be undone. That means other kinds of sale of land were not permanent. In perpetuity, says the attorney. All right? So it's legal language in perpetuity. So dror means, in Akkadian, it means literally to move about freely. And it has to do with servants who have been bound now having the state of dror, of release. Of being allowed to move about freely means they are no longer bound. So we have this idea about land being temporary until Jubilee. You can't own it permanently. You can only own it till the Jubilee. We're going to see what that means. And then people as well get dror, they get released. They're able to move about freely, means they are no longer indentured servants. Paula?
Which is very interesting because it seems like God is exclusively the owner of this land and supersedes all other arrangements that people may have between each other, which is just amazing.
Now you are a Torah scholar.
No, you just said that.
But that's exactly right. That if you read closely, what it's saying is, because it's mine. says God, as are all human beings. All of them created in my image. You don't get to say this one's deserving and this one's not. This one has a basic amount of dignity and that one shouldn't. Because they have different color, because they come from different countries, because they have a different language, because they look different, because their parents were whatever. You don't get to say that. Dror yikra. They will all be released.
In 1604, in England, which we get a lot of our common law from, was promulgated the English Poor Laws. And from that time, it was stated who was deserving of help and who was undeserving. And that's where the American tradition comes from, those 1600 poor laws.
There you go. Yeah. All right, so what do I find ironic about the idea of the land and people experiencing dror? And why is it ironic for me that the folks settling this country put it on the Liberty Bell?
Well, they were taking the land.
Thank you, Laura. As they are taking the land from the natives and murdering them wholesale or taking them as slaves, dror yikra, release for the land, and all people shall be proclaimed throughout the land. Really?
Because you're defining who is people, who are the deserving people, and the others are not.
Were valued in the vote. It's terrible.
Yeah.
Right? So Torah is completely antithetical, right? Torah understanding and Torah law would have been completely antithetical to these 1604 whatevers in Britain, right? Completely poor laws, completely antithetical, right? And the deep irony is, and I say this, I don't mean to be cheeky or sarcastic. It is an irony that is very sad for me that we put it on the Liberty Bell, and then what did we do to the land and to the people of the land? What do we continue to do to the land here and to the people, right? It just, having lived in Duluth, Minnesota, and been exposed to the minority where I lived was Native Indian. They were Indians. No, you're right. Actually, politically correct term is Indians. They want to be called Indians, not Native Americans. So the Indians, the Ojibwe, were the minority in Duluth. They're the ones who are poor. They're the ones who are undeserving. They're the ones who are on welfare. They're the ones who, whose kids don't have a future. I shouldn't say that. That it feels like we don't seem to care very much whether or not their kids can live into their full potential. And it just was a constant reminder, right, that I didn't ever really have to face. Well, that's not true. I grew up in the South. So I was always aware of what white Europeans here did to other peoples. It was a whole nother level to experience Native American decimation of their culture, of their language, that we have wrought. And then when I think about this environment and what we've done, it's like the Liberty Bell just becomes this very complicated, symbol of, yes, that's our ideal, and yes, that's what we should be reaching for. And if we go back to where that comes from and we really look at what the Torah philosophy is about what we should do, it's just shameful how out of whack with this we are living.
Maybe that's why the Liberty Bell is cracked.
The Liberty Bell is cracked.
But it's in keeping with our other documents and moments of history, because the decimation of the Indians came before this time, before the Liberty Bell. It happened before we wrote our Constitution, which did not, it said liberty, but it was really liberty for those who already had it and wanted to keep it and thought everything was fine that way. And our history has been slowly chipping away and changing that, and we're still doing that.
Right. And to be fair to Torah law, it also would have been Israelite males, who had inherited land at the conquest, and it was they who would be released. A ger toshav, somebody who came from another country who lived there and started a family, they're not included in this, which is what Rabbi Dr. Jacob Staub, points out, is there's always kind of a place you got to start, and then you hope that it evolves to be something else. And so I want to be fair that Torah also is limited in its vision.
Is to plant the seed for Frederick Douglass, for the other abolitionists, that doesn't sound like what we're living.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yes, Blanche.
So we have those sterlings among us who believe they're the law. And since I worked with the fair housing laws a good part of my life, I have dealt with the complaints against her.
Against Sterling?
Sterling,
Mm-hmm.
yes. And the people have gotten some awards. But this latest fiasco is, we had one of our first cases was about Kareem, and he came to our office and said he couldn't get an apartment. He wanted to live in Malibu. He was with the team at UCLA. And Laura's father, Roger Diamond, was the attorney I went to. And he called a press conference. And there was an uproar in the city because this basketball player was such a hero. And so, of course, he got the apartment. But it was...
But look what you had to do to get him to get the apartment.
And that is right. That is a beautiful story about that. It's now we know how Laura comes by her. It rolls off her brain and heart and tongue easily. The evolution of these that it takes people like you and Laura's father Roger. It takes people who are ready and willing to challenge the current understanding of the application of our most cherished ideals and to expand them. And for me, the important thing you bring up is that freedom, as we expand who's entitled to freedom and liberty and the protection of their, civil rights, it expands freedom for everyone, right? That basketball player and all of you who challenged it, once that happened and you won, now it expands the idea of who is free, which is why it is always so interesting to me that people who are against gay marriage say it threatens the institution of marriage. I'm like, show me one case in history where expanding of freedom has ever threatened the original group's legal rights. It's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. Bert?
So the question is, what's the point behind all this?
What's the point?
And what I get out of it, behind all of this, is to teach us humility.
Say that again, Bert.
Teach us humility. Whether it be Shabbat every week or whether it be Shabbat of the land, that even though we think the land is ours, we act as if it's ours, it really isn't. And that, at least to me, that's the lesson here that we can take even though we don't practice this.
So who would be willing to go get the rest of the copies off the copier? Thank you, Lisa. Funny you should say that, Bert. What's the point?
Is there any symbolism to the fact that the Liberty Bell is cracked?
Yes.
I think we have arrived, Reuben, at a new understanding, yes, of what the crack symbolizes and represents. Yes, I think we have articulated that this morning, and I will never look at the Liberty Bell the same way again, I have to tell you.
And it should stay cracked.
And it should stay cracked until
everything is right.
It's funny you say that, Sarah. Right? Not haha funny, but I have a colleague who, whenever we gathered the tzitziot for the Shema, the words at which we gather the tzitziot are, right, that we should be gathered from the four corners of the earth. That's where we pull together the tzitzit, wrap them around our finger in preparation for Adonai Echad. God is one, meaning we are all one in that. And I have a colleague who, because a lot of us interpret that, we don't just go to gather us from all corners of the earth. We have a state of Israel. Most of us don't choose to live there. So it's not like we're longing to be gathered to Israel. Instead, a lot of us in progressive Jewish life have a kavanah that gather all peoples from the four corners of the earth into an understanding Adonai Echad, right? And I have a colleague, and this is common among us who, talk about this stuff and care about it. And so I have a colleague who gathers all four tzitziot with that kavanah and then drops one. And she says, may there come a time where I don't have to drop one. And until all peoples come together from the four corners of the earth, I have to drop one. And, that same lovely idea should stay cracked until, and B'imhei Rabbi Amenu, halavai, it should only be speedily and in our day that we'd need to mend the crack. All right, so we're going to look at the commentary of Rabbi Bradley Shavit Artson. And so we're going to come down to the Israelite farmer at the bottom of page 1. Somebody read?
The Israelite farmer planted and worked the field in accordance with the practices of Judaism. For example, by leaving the corners of the field to the poor stream, bringing tithes to Jerusalem. As idyllic as the people at home in their land might be, there was a danger as well.
Look at the back of your packet. Now we're going to the back of your packet. The very back page looks like this. Yes? Okay, go ahead.
Jews living freely on their own homeland could well begin to think of the land as theirs by right. It would be a small step to assert that since the land responds to human labor, it is ultimately a tool for humans to use as they see fit.
Go on.
Once every 7 years, the mitzvah of Shemitah presents a reminder that we merely use the earth, but that ultimately the land is not ours, nor any human's property. As individuals, we are able to borrow land, utensils, and material things, but must ultimately return them to the cycle of nature.
Because we are given it as achuzah, a holding. Right? As again, if you look at the Akkadian and the language in the Bible, you can see that it means a temporary holding. Because it ultimately, God, and later in our Parsha, God says, because y'all are essentially tenants on my land. All y'all are tenants. You don't own anything, as Bert said. It's mine. Y'all get to use it within the limits that I set. In our progressive religious language, we get to use the land as long as we place limits on that are protective of the absolute integrity of the land itself and our awareness that we do not own anything in the cosmos.
And our bodies as well.
And our bodies as well. That's why Shabbat is not optional. You do not own your own body or your own labor either. God does. The force in this universe that calls us into justice and equity and compassion and healing and transformation and love and compassion for one another demands that we stop. All right. As a species, Bert.
As a species, we're a part of that recurrent cycle and thus are permanently linked to the limitations and rules imposed on the world. The Torah, through the institution of Shemitah, records God's sacred truth that the land is mine, but you are strangers resident with me.
Go on.
Ramban clarifies that verse by paraphrasing it as, don't think that you are so essential. The world is not a plaything for human beings, and the vast array of organic and living things serve a purpose higher than human whim. Together with humanity, the rest of the cosmos is a living, interlocking symphony to our Creator. We are the tenants, but God is the only Baal Habayit.
Okay, and so we're going to go to your point because Ramban is saying what Bert was saying, that he thinks ultimately this is about humility. Bert, go on to see how that is interpreted by our brilliant Rabbi Shavit Artson.
Distracted by the brilliance of human achievement and deafened by the clatter of our own insolent self-absorption, we can too easily forget that we are part of an order we neither made nor sustain. A little lower than the angels, yes, but still a long way from being masters of the universe. Human beings are trapped in an illusion that we hold ourselves or our species to be the measure of all things. Only by linking our own destiny to something transcendent, by joining our future to an eternal living force, by molding our deeds into a song of praise and gratitude, can human beings escape the despair of our own mortality and fallibility. Focusing on our own needs and desires, we will always be disappointed in ourselves and the world. But if we lift our eyes to a higher vision, if we set our feet on a more tested path, we can soar above our plight as on eagle's wings.
Oh, right?
I think one of the things that helps you do this is children.
Tell me.
Make you humble.
Because when you have children and you're concerned with the future through children, it lifts you to another place. And your own concerns are more balanced.
Put in a different perspective, yes? Mm-hmm. I just was on a conference call with other rabbis who are taking in interns from HUC, the Reform Seminary this year. We are taking an intern, as always, and we are getting, by the way, Zach. So Nadine's husband, Zach, who was an ECC teacher here, will be our intern for the year. Yeah, we're very happy. So we had a conversation about mentoring, and we were given an article to read called "Touching the Future," and it talked a lot about whether it's through children, students, a mentoring relationship with someone even of similar generational age. It's this idea that you get to touch the future, and there's a way that is a serious corrective to our obsession with our circumstances in the present, right? That what I hear you saying is what he's saying, which when we link our lives to something transcendent, we are lifted. It's not just that we're in service of it, we are lifted up and out of our own, preoccupation with our own current circumstances. And I think that's a really, really important spiritual teaching.
God can drop the ladder, but only we can climb it.
How many of these do you have in your back pocket, Bert? Laura.
What is that higher vision that we're lifting our eyes to? I mean, what is it these concrete mitzvot that we're talking about, treating the land the way it should be treated, treating people the way it should be treated? Does it necessarily require a belief in some universal being, or is it just about the release? And what is that vision?
For him, I think he is talking about the fact that rather than being so obsessed with our stuff, we start to think about a relationship to stuff. What is stuff? What is our place in the stuff of the cosmos? Right? That there's a way when one lifts one's attention from the minutia to the idea of we need to have an understanding that it is all God, it is all belonging to itself, and that's a transcendent idea. But it's not just an idea. Like, if we really take some time to reflect and connect to practices that bring us into living out that assumption, in this case, the Jubilee, the Yovel, the Shemitah, if we actually did that, Shabbat every week, right? If we actually did that, we're connecting our lives and our attention and our being to something that's a corrective for how we get so self-focused.
So answers here, it's really more of the higher vision is paying attention in a different way.
Yeah. and paying attention to something larger and way bigger than my car's 14 years old. When do I get how do I get a new one? It's like, okay, but I have a car. Other people don't have transportation, or other people in Africa are walking 6 hours a day to get clean water so their family doesn't dehydrate or die of some horrible disease in a stagnant pool. Like, do you know what I mean? It's that literal, a corrective for us. It changes how I get in my car.
That's one of the functions of Jewish blessings, of the idea of saying blessings at all, is to remind our consciousness, whether we're eating or whatever we're doing in our lives, of that connection.
And I think it also says, this, what I love about it, it's actually the basis for bankruptcy laws. Right?
It's what?
This portion I've heard is actually the basis for bankruptcy laws.
Right.
And our way of thinking that no one deserves to be in debt forever, that everyone deserves a second chance. Especially like when Sarah talks about the children, sometimes the parents have made a lot of mistakes, but the children deserve a shot just the same as any other child, So you want to get to a place where you can even out the playing field. And we might have the 1% if we had something closer to these laws.
Right.
Things get
100%.
There's a real concentration of wealth, and it's hard to move against it.
That's right. And this corrects it generationally. What Linda's talking about the imbalance of wealth, to your point, Paula, true, some individuals will die in indentured servitude, but to what Linda's saying is societally it meant it reset things generationally. So, because right now, the concentration of wealth in our country, right, it gets worse and worse. As it makes interest and makes more money for the people with money, their kids inherit more money. And inheritance taxes are supposed to balance some of that, but it doesn't. I want to go back to what Laura asked and go to the Behar, Rabbi Shefa Gold. I just want to read a paragraph of her. You can read the rest at home, and we're going to be sitting with some of this in our next class, in our meditation class in a moment. But Laura, read that paragraph. No, wait, because Laura likes to listen and it moves her. So Linda, read the paragraph once we have heard the voice.
The other side.
I got it.
Once we have heard the voice of the land, we will never be the same, even when we begin to play the game of possessions again. Once there is that flash of self-awareness that this is a game and all that we see is really God in disguise, our playing will be transformed. And perhaps once, maybe twice in a lifetime, at the time of the Jubilee, all masks, all roles will for a time fall away. Then we will know that we are loved by God, not for the role we play or the work we do or the knowledge or things we have acquired, but for our true essence alone. Knowing this allows us to see and love each other in the same way. The Jubilee strips us down and teaches us the pure joy of existence. Behar challenges us and asks, are you ready to sound the shofar and call forth the consciousness of Jubilee? Are you ready to let go of everything and return to your true home in God?
Did Rabbi Gold answer your question, Laura? Unbelievable, as always, her brilliance and insight into what's the point, what is this about, what is this supposed to do? It's profound what she has to say.
What is the exact translation of Behar, that word?
At the mountain. Behar. Literally in the mountain. But you can't be in the mountain unless you're the rabbi's writing a midrash. They love that. Behar means at the mountain, and that's how we started. God said to Moshe, Behar Sinai, at the mountain. And then people say, well, what does Yovel actually mean? What is Jubilee? What is that? You know what Yovel actually means? Ram. Or the ram's horn. That's what Yovel actually means.
Does anybody keep track of Jubilee year now? Sure.
Yes, and it doesn't. There's lots written. As soon as Israel was re-statified, and we became the sovereign nation, of Israel again, it was a huge discussion in the observant world about, how do you do this? How do you participate in a contemporary economy and keep Torah law? Because there's lots of laws that are only true in the state of, when you have the land of Israel. So we were always like, we don't have to worry about that. We don't have to worry about remission of debts because we're not in Israel. Yeah, but that now when you're in Israel, it's a whole nother legal conundrum. And you should have seen the machinations of the chief rabbinate to deal with it. It was a huge, in Talmudic times it was an issue too. That's why we have the Pruz Bowl. But that's another discussion. So if you wanted, you could track the legal discussion, the halachic legal discussion, and the renderings of decisions about how to get out of Yovel, because you can't participate in the world economy and do Shemitah and Yovel. Really, right? You can't take a year off from selling your Jaffa oranges, or right? Especially when it was founded, when the state was founded.
Wouldn't that be 2 years? Because you're taking out the 49th year.
Because you're not planting.
The 7. And then
you got so the next year, yeah. And so that's what we didn't read. What I was going to say to you is that's where you said God was involved. Is God says, don't worry, you shouldn't get panicky and stingy, thinking, what are we going to eat? It's 2 years. I'll make sure that your crops are so productive, you'll be eating it for 3 years.
This last question
that Rabbi Shefa Gold asks. Yes.
It reminds me of something else, and I think the answer should be no. I'm thinking of the men that hold up, or the people that hold up the world, the Lamed Vav.
The Lamed Vavniks.
And someone said, a wise person said, if you know you're a Lamed Vavnik, then you're really not. They don't know who they are because
they would never think that of themselves. God forbid.
They would never think that of themselves. And I was just thinking about that with this line. Are you ready to let go of everything in return for what you're asking? And maybe if you think you are, then you're really not ready, or something.
Yeah. So I think what Rabbi Gold is getting at is that we are challenged periodically to this. Not always. Not that we shouldn't ask the question frequently, but that Yovel and Shemitah come to challenge us to really, really get it, that it's all a game. How much I have, how much I don't have, versus how much you have, versus how much he doesn't have, that it's all a game. And that's not what value is really about. Value is that we are expressions of the one and only thing, which is God. The only reality, capital R, as Rabbi Rami Shapiro might say. Are we ready to drop our attachment to status and stuff and clothes and cars and really, really live from a place, even for a moment, of what I am is God. I'm a wave, but what I really am is ocean. Are we ready to remember we're ocean? And what would that mean? And what would that call out from me that makes me frankly a little nervous? Right? All right. We'll close with the words of, as you know, one of my favorites, the poet, the late Minnesota poet of blessed memory, Ruth Bryn. Behar, testament of freedom. The people of America read about the sabbatical year and the year of the Jubilee as a testament of freedom. In the beginning, they engraved the words of Leviticus on the Liberty Bell, proclaim liberty throughout the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. Generations later, the slaves, in hopes of their freedom, sang the year of the Jubilee and Go Down Moses. You made us to be free. You set the spark in every human heart. Now, help us fan the spark to flame, to light our way. Now, help us break the chains, tear down the walls. Help us bring freedom at last to all the world.
You've been listening to Rabbi Amy Bernstein's Friday morning Torah study from Kehillat Israel in Pacific Palisades, California. For more information, go to our website, www.ourki.org.